systematically, year after year, raising their students' test scores, and these teachers on the left, unfortunately, are not. And so what you can see is that there's a very strong relationship between the probability that a kid is in college at the age of 20 versus the value added of the teacher he had, say, in 4th grade. Or, this works, you see a very similar relationship actually in all the grades that we've studied from kindergarten to 8th grade. Okay, so that's college attendance versus teacher value added. Now you can also compute measures of the quality of the college that each student is attending. So not only are you more likely to attend college, but we've developed an index of the quality of every college in the US, which is just measured by the earnings of the graduates of that college. That's one sort of simple index of a college's quality. And you can see that you're not only more likely to attend college if you had a better teacher, you're also attending a better college conditional on going to college in the first place. Okay? In addition, you're also earning more as an adult if you had a higher value added teacher going back to 4th grade. I'll talk about the magnitudes, like how big these effects are in a little bit, but what I want you to see here is that there's a very strong relationship across the spectrum as you move from the lowest value added teachers to the very highest value added teachers. Kids are earning significantly more as adults if they happen to basically by chance be lucky and get a teacher who was on this side of the spectrum instead of the closer to the middle or toward the bottom. And finally, just to stress, teachers have important impacts not just on economic outcomes, but also on other outcomes that we care about from a social point of view. This is the fraction of women who have teenage births versus the value added of the teachers they had again in elementary school. And you can see, quite strikingly, having a better teacher in elementary school ends up not only improving college attendance and increasing earnings, but also makes you less likely to have a teen pregnancy. So there's this broad spectrum of outcomes, and I'm not showing you all of them here. I'm happy to talk more later about other outcomes. Across this broad spectrum of outcomes, there's very clear evidence that teachers have big, significant impacts on kids. Now, one interesting pattern that emerges in these studies is that, and this has actually been a concern in the prior literature before our most recent work, is that teachers' impacts fade out on test scores, but as I've just shown you, reemerge in adulthood. So a standard finding in the prior literature is that if you had a better teacher in, say, 3rd grade, we'd see you doing better at the end of 3rd grade, a little bit better at the end of 4th grade, but then somewhat surprisingly and disappointingly, by the time you're in 5th, 6th, or 7th grade, we're not really seeing continued test score achievement gains. And that's what's called the fade-out pattern in education, which is a very robust pattern found across many, many different studies. Now, the really shocking and surprising thing from this recent work is that that fade-out pattern, we observed the same exact thing in our data. This is now going back to the kindergarten study. What this graph plots is what is the impact of being in a better kindergarten class on your test score at the end of each grade. And you can see that there are these big effects at the end of kindergarten, and then those effects start to really get much smaller over time, and by the time you're in 6th or 7th or 8th grade, there's hardly any visible benefit from having been in a better kindergarten versus a worse kindergarten, right? And so from an educational point of view, that seems kind of disappointing, right? It's like these impacts are not lasting that long. But here's the surprising thing. When you look at adult outcomes, and here I've changed the axis to earnings, okay, in a way that I won't get into here, but basically look at the corresponding impacts in adulthood, and the really surprising thing is that the effect comes back almost exactly to the magnitude you would have predicted by the kindergarten test score data. You see that dot basically lines up with that dot, even though all these impacts on intermediate test score achievement are much, much smaller. And so the question then is, why do we see this really surprising pattern where teachers and classroom quality, etc., don't seem to be having a lasting effect on students' test score achievement on standardized tests, but they are helping them in the long run, right, in this very clear way that I just showed you before. And so here, we think, and this is still somewhat of an open research question, we think that non-cognitive skills may be a critical pathway that explains teachers' long-term impacts. And so let me show you a little bit of evidence on that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what else you think might be going on here, because I think that's an important puzzle for researchers to resolve. So here's the idea, here's what we have to say on what I call non-cognitive skills, or skills that are not directly measured on standardized tests. So it turns out that in this Tennessee study, people collected data on non-cognitive measures, things like a student's effort, a student's initiative, whether a student exhibited disruptive behavior, for a subset of these Tennessee students in 4th grade and in 8th grade. So they tracked these students for a while after the kindergarten experiment. And so here's the way they collected that data. They said, they asked teachers to fill out these surveys, and they said, please consider the behavior of one of your students, say Jim Smith, over the last 2 to 3 months. Circle the number that indicates how often the child exhibits this behavior. And so, for example, we asked, does the child act restless, or is he often unable to sit still on a scale of 1 to 5? Does the child annoy or interfere with his peers' work on a scale of 1 to 5? Okay, so the first thing that I want to show you is that these non-cognitive measures are also very highly predictive of success in adulthood. So the way I like to describe this figure is basically showing you that annoying people earn less as adults. So this is a measure of that non-cognitive skill, and this is your earnings in adulthood. And you can see that the pattern actually looks remarkably similar to what I showed you for the standardized tests. So kids who are doing well in terms of these non-cognitive skills are earning 2.5 times more than the kids who are on the bottom of that spectrum. Now what's really interesting, and that's what's shown in this table, I'm not going to get into the details here, but what this table shows you is we ask, what are the effects of non-cognitive versus cognitive skills on long-term outcomes? Okay, so suppose I've shown you that both of them matter, but which matters more? That's what this first column is asking. And what it's showing you basically is that the non-cognitive score matters a lot more than the cognitive score for long-term impacts like earnings. For every 1 percentile improvement in the non-cognitive score, you have an $87 improvement in earnings. For every 1 percentile improvement in the cognitive math and reading standardized test score, you only have a $36 improvement in earnings. Now, the other thing that's very interesting is that while improvements in non-cognitive skills have long-term impacts on your earnings, they don't seem to be correlated with better achievement on standardized tests in later grades. Okay, so if you have better non-cognitive skills at the end of kindergarten, we see that you're earning more as an adult, but you don't seem to be doing better on your 8th grade tests. In contrast, if you did better on your earlier standardized tests, that does predict that you will do better on later standardized tests. Now, if you think about the logic, that makes non-cognitive skills the type of factor that could generate the pattern that we're seeing. Where suppose you have an excellent kindergarten teacher who improves a child's non-cognitive skills, teaches them discipline, teaches them how to get along with the other kids in the class and so forth, that does not end up showing up in terms of better test performance down the road, but it does have big payoffs as an adult. And so that's the kind of thing that could explain the pattern that we're seeing. One thing that's very consistent with that is that we find a much stronger fade-out effect for these standardized test scores, but not for the non-cognitive skills. So if you had a better teacher in early grades, you continue to have better non-cognitive skills as measured in 4th grade, as measured in 8th grade, but your standardized tests, your performance drops away. So this strikes us as a candidate explanation for what's going on in the data, and it highlights what I was saying earlier, that standardized tests provide perhaps one useful way to measure teachers' impacts. But my guess is that there's a lot of other stuff going on, and it might turn out that standardized tests provide a useful proxy, but teachers are really having impacts on students through much more complex and nuanced ways. The last result that I want to show you and that I will conclude with is just this idea that high value-added teachers have great value. And the subtext to that is even if value-added is measured using a few years of data. So that relates to this policy debate about using test scores to evaluate teachers. So here's a way to think about the value of excellent teachers. So suppose I take this bell curve of the distribution of teachers that we have in a school system. So, on the x-axis here is the teacher's value added, that is the teacher's impact on test scores. And as we've been talking about, some teachers raise test scores a lot and others don't. So suppose I take teachers who are in the very upper tail of that distribution. I'm going to call them star teachers in the top 5% of the distribution based on this value-added measure, okay? What is the value of these teachers to society? So you can use our estimates from what I was showing you earlier, like the earnings impacts of these teachers, the impacts on college and so forth, to do a calculation like this, where we find that on average, having a top 5% star teacher for a single year raises a child's cumulative lifetime income by $50,000. Okay, so the average kid, if he in 4th grade has a top 5% teacher instead of an average teacher, our calculations imply that if you add up all the earnings he gets over his life, at the US average, he's going to earn about $50,000 more total from that single year of better teaching. Now, of course, a teacher teaches many kids simultaneously, so when you think about it from the teacher's point of view, for a class of average size in our data that's 28 students, the cumulative lifetime gains from having a star teacher for a single year surpass $1.4 million. Okay, so if the 95th percentile teacher versus the median teacher is generating gains of $1.4 million for this classroom of students. And I want to stress, I've not put any value on all the non-monetary benefits that we think these teachers might be having. For instance, the impacts on teenage pregnancy that I showed you, or many other social outcomes that we can't measure, like potential impacts on crime, for instance. Now, that just shows you the direct value of teachers and is not directly policy relevant, because if you're going to use these value-added measures to evaluate teachers, you're going to have to do so using only a few years of classroom data. Okay, so that's going to make value-added estimates unstable over time. The calculation I just showed you is assuming that you can find those top